Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. I'm Sheena Chestnut-Greitens, TNSR's editor-in-chief, and I'm here today with Dr. Ryan Vest, our executive editor. We're pleased to have joining us Dr. Carter Malkasian, author of the article Wars of the Middle East and South Asia, 1945 to 1992, which is featured in Volume 9, Issue 1 of the journal. Carter is the author of The American War in Afghanistan, A History, and Illusions of Victory, The Anbar Awakening and Rise of the Islamic State. He teaches at the National War College. The views expressed here are his own. Carter, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. It's great to have you on the show.
Hey, thank you so much, Sheen, and thank you, Ryan. It's a real honor to be here.
Carter, in your article, you argue that the experience of war and state building in the Middle East and South Asia during the Cold War was significantly different than Europe. In the West, I think we're pretty familiar with the forces and history that developed the world map as we know it today, but we may not be as familiar with other areas of the world. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how some of these other areas developed differently than Europe and the West.
So, in the Middle East and South Asia, which of course have a very long history, their state building history and the relationship between state building and war is different from what we saw in the West. Whereas in the West, briefly, we like to say that war helped build the state, and then the state, as it got stronger, made more war, to paraphrase Charles Tilley. In the Middle East and South Asia, what we see happening over about a 100-year period is that before 1945, states like the Ottoman Empire or Egypt, as it was at the time, or Iran, they were trying to build up their militaries. They were trying to fight conventional industrialized war. And their states were building, and we can see that with the eventual development of Turkey. But in all of those states, there were inhibitions towards the state becoming stronger. Lots of different areas, different groups, different communities, different provinces tended to be autonomous or independent. States had trouble instituting things like conscription, and large amounts of society had to be left out of it. So we see a state building process that isn't as centralized or as consolidated as what you see in Europe. Now, then after 1945, you see another set of states develop, often on the basis of autocracies, like Egypt, Pakistan, Syria, Iraq. And they're also building up as states. They also have a large focus on war because of some of the international and regional constraints they're falling under at the time. But they too have difficulty developing. It's not that they don't develop in that regard. It's not that they don't build up power and become stronger. It's that there's inhibitions and constraints on how far that they can go in doing that. And we really see that develop by the second half of the Cold War, where we have more guerrilla movements, more terrorist movements, more movements seeking autonomy. So a lot of these states are facing some kind of insurgency or guerrilla war all the time. Many of them have trouble controlling their territory, and a few of them fall apart. So that's a different kind of story from what we've seen with the West. Moreover, the literature about what happens in the Middle East and South Asia is very detailed when it comes to individual states or even tribes or religious groups, but it's much less apparent, much less existent when it comes to the regions as a whole or these long term trends. It's especially less so when we talk about the post 1945 period. So we get this rich literature that exists for the West, but a literature for the Middle East and South Asia that, while rich in some detailed respects, is not as rich when it comes to the overall larger trends that are happening.
One of the things I think is so interesting and valuable about the article is the perspective you draw out on war and state building. And I remember reading Charles Tilley and War Makes the State and the State Makes War as the paradigm by which to understand this relationship back when I was an undergraduate in college. And so it was really interesting to read this different overview of a much more varied relationship between war and state building. And you think about the Bellicist school about the relationship between war and state building. But there's also a long history in maybe strategic studies and the British context of thinking about the global nature of warfare, of thinking about the relationship between war and society. And that's something that you particularly emphasize is the social dimension of the evolution of warfare. Can you talk a little bit more about these various perspectives on what forces shape warfare and what lessons that you think we can draw from this debate?
When I started to write the article, I was very interested in war and society and broad overviews of how war has changed. And the book I turned to start thinking about this, and a friend of mine, Daniel Marson, kind of does the same thing, is Michael Howard's War in European History. And Michael Howard, of course, also wrote a variety of other books on war and society and the uses of history, looking at how war and society has changed over time. And so, one of the big points he makes is that if you want to understand war, not just look at its lessons, not just try to apply it in policy, but if you want to understand it more broadly, you have to put it in an international, political, social, cultural, technological, economic context. You have to understand everything else that's happening around it. And I felt that that was an important thing to do when stepping forward on this particular study. Because I think it's when you're looking at warfare, we value looking at how it's going to affect our policymakers. We value understanding the history so our policymakers can better understand what to do. But if we want to understand why war matters, you have to understand how it matters to the people, how it affects the people, how it affects economics, how it affects politics. You have to draw it to these larger themes that are happening. So I've thought that to be important. In terms of comparing it to Tilly, I think that, taking a little bit from Howard, is that context matters a lot. And my understanding of Tilly would be he would readily admit this. He readily thought and said all the time that the Western European experience is not necessarily going to match the experiences of everywhere else in the world. But that context matters. The development that we saw happening in Western Europe isn't necessarily going to match other parts of the world because they're in a different economic, political, technological context. And I would just go one step further in that. It's not just the regional comparison, it's the comparison over time. Western Europe developed in a certain period where weapons technology favored the state, when weapons technology demanded a strong state to be able to use it effectively. Other areas are developing in a time when that's not the same, when the weapons technology has changed, as have other aspects changed. And in that different situation, how their state develops is going to be different. And if one could draw a gigantic counterfactual, which I wouldn't do anything than written, but if you were to draw a gigantic counterfactual and say, well, what if the West had developed at this later time? A serious argument would be that it would have developed differently too.
That's really interesting. As I read through this, one of the other things I really picked up on in here is that you identified two themes about the history of war in these regions. Those themes relate to politics, technology, society, and culture, much like what you've been talking about, and how it affected the conduct of war. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about these themes and why they're important to understanding this history, especially in this region.
I think one of the main things we see happening in this region after 1945 is that the use of force becomes more in the hands of the people. And that is different from what we've seen elsewhere, where the use of force becomes more in the hands of the state. And even in the Western context, we might say that after 1945, whereas like in 1945, it was the people mobilizing in support of the state. After 1945, it becomes more of a picture of the state is using war and the people are less involved. Think about like we don't have conscription anymore, but there's a variety of other ways that we might characterize that. But in South Asia and the Middle East, we see a little bit more that no, warfare is more in the hands of the people. We see that most readily with like guerrilla warfare and terrorism, the difficulty the state has waging war. All right, so why does that happen? So it's the technological and the social and the cultural trends that help explain a good amount of that. And I'm just going to take the technological one here first, and then if you guys want to draw out some of the other ones, we can do that next. But the change in weapons technology that happens really before 1945 is kind of accelerated right after 1945, helps the people use force to a greater degree. The advent of assault rifles. Now, one soldier has the power that a squad or maybe even a platoon previously would have had. The rocket propelled grenade puts the explosive power of a cannon in a group of four, a group of three, in a very small number of people. Radios enable better communications. As the Cold War gets going, they're not really related to the Cold War, but separately, people learn how to make car bombs. And eventually, you learn how to make suicide car bombs that cause a tremendous amount of destruction. So that puts in the hands of the people weapons that previously could only be in the hands of the state, and it would have taken a great effort to be able to use. For the people, these are easier to use. The training time for someone who was in, let's say, the Iranian Besiege during the Iran-Iraq War, they were trained for about a month. The Mujahideen in the Afghan War, most of them didn't train at all. Probably at least half didn't train at all. The remaining half got about 2 weeks, 4 weeks of training. So very small amounts of rudimentary training were sufficient to create effective units. Whereas the state, Egypt, Pakistan, even Israel, when they want to train a unit to fight, they have to put at least 6 months in. And that's not really including more advanced training, more unit level training. So they have to devote significant amounts of time to get their people ready to fight a conventional style. For a group to be able to fight in a guerrilla or terrorist style, much less time. The education level that's required is also less because you don't have any of those technical things you need to do. You don't need to maintain aircraft, don't need to maintain helicopters, don't have to do the same kind of in-depth logistical training that education benefits to a great deal. So these changes, which the ones I've described are pretty much technological, economic, these lead to a situation where war is more in the hands of the people.
Can you talk a little bit about, or maybe give a couple of examples? One of the things I really appreciated about this piece is the broad view, but also just the specificity and granularity of some of the examples that you give of cases where this happened and really shaped the contours of conflict over time in a particular country. Can you give a couple of examples that really jumped out at you when you were doing the research of how this changing technology of violence democratized these patterns of violence and what that actually looks like in terms of patterns of conflict that emerge?
So when the Islamic regime takes over in Iran in 1979, they immediately get into a war, as you know, with Iraq. And that puts them in a difficult situation. They don't have the international assistance. They don't have the kind of funding that's immediately available to Iraq. They don't have the ability to maintain their weapons, which some of which are fairly advanced, but they can't maintain them if they're not getting Western assistance for it. And so they're faced with Iraq conducting an attack on them. And when that happens, the country has to change a lot of its methods and its tactics. And some of that turns to Ayatollah Khomeini starting to talk about more people joining the military, more people mobilizing to support Islam, mobilizing to support the Shia faith, and mobilizing in a willingness to be martyrs. And he uses Islam effectively to generate support and to get people to start fighting. But that's only part of the equation. The other part of the equation is a lot of their tactics change. We often look at that in the sense of, well, they're doing more what were called human wave attacks. I'm a little bit leery of that term, but it basically meant they'd be sending large amounts of militia into battle with less training than they otherwise would be received. But it also involved more guerrilla-style attacks on Iraqi offensives that were moving against them to cut off their supply lines and to help besiege places like Abadan, until the Iranians got an edge later on. As a part of this war, you also see them start to develop using proxies into Iraq, using proxies with Kurds, and connected to it using proxies like Hezbollah in other locations. So what you see is Iran starting to develop a different way of waging war, a way of waging war that better fits its situation, that enables it to use its people and to use its assets to survive in this conflict. And you also see in this conflict how Islam becomes a way to motivate people, a way to mobilize people to fight, which you can see in murals that are painted at the time, you can see in poetry that's written at the time, and of course you can see in the sermons of Ayatollah Khomeini. And so what you see there then is at the end of that conflict, you have not only a new way of war, you have a regime that's more secure, more stable, and has an Islamic way of rule that has been reinforced by the war that's been fought. So that would be one example. The other example that's easy, for me in particular to talk about is the Afghanistan example, again in 1979. We'll probably talk a little bit more as we go on, but that Soviet invasion is very much a turning point, very much a contingent moment in the history of the Middle East and in South Asia, and in driving warfare more to be in the hands of the people. But when that conflict happens, you see almost spontaneously in various locations Islamic leaders calling fatwas, edicts, declaring jihad, saying it's time to start fighting against the Soviets. And you see that in a variety of different places, not ordered from above, just occurring from the ground up. Now, as that starts to happen, Afghans have access to weapons. They have access to the Kalashnikovs that we already spoke about. They have access to RPGs, and we start to encourage that and give them more access to it by the funding that we provide. And it's easy for those Afghans to start using those weapons. And as I mentioned before, a lot of them start using them without any training at all. Mullimer's biographer talks about how he loved using the RPG 7. He received no training in using the RPG 7. And in fact, according to his biography, he never left Afghanistan. I'm not sure that's actually true, but that's according to his biography. So not a lot of training to be doing this stuff, but very effective. They use some SA-7s and of course our Stingers to shoot down Soviet aircraft. Some training was required in that, but that didn't require years of training to do that. With remarkably little training, they were able to go forward and do these things. And so, how many forces are they able to mobilize through this? They're mobilizing about 150,000, which is about equivalent to the Soviet forces and the communist Afghan forces that were fighting, at least during most of the war. It's also equivalent in terms of percentage of the population mobilized. That percentage is about equivalent to what Egypt mobilized in 1973, which is very much a high point of Egyptian mobilization for the Arab-Israeli war at that time. So we're seeing they're able to mobilize a lot. The use of the weapons is simple. Islam is helping people mobilize to a greater extent. But that, of course, a lot of that movement that happens also leads to further development of Islam, further development of these tactics and ideas that goes throughout the Middle East. And I haven't talked a lot about terrorism and Abdul Azam and bin Laden, but maybe I'll leave that for this point here.
Throughout the article, you mentioned that identities and loyalties, alternative to the state, and above all, Islam, legitimized violence by non state groups. How did identities, loyalties, and Islam in particular play a role in legitimizing this violence outside the state?
Yeah, so that's a very important point, and I probably should have been just slightly more careful when I wrote it too. That in a way, I don't want to make it sound like Islam itself is violent, but Islam does legitimize groups, does help legitimize non-state groups, and it can endorse their violence if it is for the proper reasons. Now, I know there's a lot of debatable things that are within that, but that's a little bit more of the nuance behind it, I guess. So, a lot of the states after 1945, like I mentioned before, they're autocratic. They're often strongly driven by nationalism. Nationalism at the time that had a strong secular tinge to it. But it's hard for nationalism alone, which was new, autocratic regimes, which are based on a singular person, it also tends to be secular. It's hard for them to have credibility throughout all of these countries, some of which are somewhat new countries. There's other sources of identity that matter. Some of those are the local communities that people are from. So we'd see that in terms of tribes. But you can also see that in networks that form between different groups that have their own strong basis of loyalty among them. So if you look at a place like Pakistan, where the army is created pretty much from the Punjab, the Pashtun minorities in particular, that meant that other groups don't have the same buy-in to the state. The state is new, and Ayub Khan and other Pakistani leaders are trying to get the state to have greater credibility, but they have to deal with all these other tribal and community identities that exist. That can even include within the military the networks that the militaries form within themselves to help officers promote themselves and move forward. That identity itself can be in conflict with the nation. So these different identities make it harder for a state to form itself. So you can think again to Pakistan. Did they get most of the country to view India as a threat? Yes. Did they get most of the people of India, of Pakistan, to be willing to be conscripted to get to join the military against India? No. Their generals would readily admit that getting a Sindhi to join was not something that was going to be possible. Getting a Baluch to join is hard to do. Baluch are allowed to join, but it's hard to do. So they recognize these things, and it's easy to see in a country as diverse, as rich, as populous as Pakistan is, how hard it would be to get everyone united together into something. Islam. So Islam's always been a strong source of identity within the Middle East and South Asia. It pre-existed the states, and it has a universal content to it that expands across the different states that exist there. So, and furthermore, Islam, I mentioned fatwas and edicts previously. Religious leaders are the ones who ultimately have the only authority to declare holy war, to declare jihad. Secular leaders might want to say they can do that, and they might declare it from time to time, but they don't have the authority that the religious leader has to do that. So that means that the religious leader has an ability to allow a group to conduct armed warfare and to legitimize it and to say that that's possible for it to do. And then when you take that and combine that with now that there's weapons more available that allow groups to do this, what you get is that Islam and the democratization of weapons technology is intertwined. And so you see it intertwined that as weapons get easier to use, you also see that Islam is becoming stronger as a political force. And that's not to say that the ease of using weapons is the cause of Islam having greater influence in the area by the end of the Cold War, but it's intertwined, it's correlated, it's happening together. And you can see the different places where it's happening together. So in that way, Islam has an important role there.
You write about the way that the delegation of violence to the people and the breakdown in state authority have intensified since the end of the Cold War. And I wondered if you could talk about how foreign intervention played a role in the story that you tell in this piece. And how can we think about modern day conflicts in the Middle East being shaped by the changes in warfare occurring during the Cold War and then in the post Cold War period, as compared to
Yeah,
the post Cold War period, maybe?
yeah, no, thank you. That's very important. And like so, I've talked about weapons technology. I've talked about identity, but intervention is very important here. So like the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan is a key moment because it triggers, instigates, prompts people to want to fight. It allows people to declare jihad with real grounding that you have to defend this intervention from infidels who are trying to get rid of Islam in places. Like gives it this very strong grounding. So that generates the guerrilla warfare that we see there. It generates some of the initial ideas of terrorism that spreads beyond that. So that sets the stage for the big developments that we see happen after 2003. And so the Cold War developments are big, and one might argue that what happens after 2001 is even greater in the developments that occur because you see the second breakdown of Afghanistan, you see the breakdown of Iraq, you see the conflicts that are there spreading into Syria, spreading into other places, Yemen breaking down. You see a much wider breakdown in states after the Cold War than you did during the Cold War. And so again, the interventions that are happening there, they propel it. Our intervention in Afghanistan took a little bit of time for that to start to happen, but it does motivate people to fight. And that's not to get into Afghanistan too much. It's not to say that that's the only reason things played out the way they did, but it's generating the reasons for the Taliban to fight, reasons for Pakistanis to support the Taliban, reasons for some other foreigners to come fight in Afghanistan. And Iraq does that even more so. If you go back and read some of the works on some of the Arabic works on Iraq in 2003, 2004, 2005, why were a lot of these people fighting? Resistance. Resistance to us. They knew about Al Qaeda at the time, but they weren't fighting for an Islamic State then. And Al Qaeda in Iraq was going to gain more dominance, but that wasn't the case in 2003, 2004, 2005. What's immediately motivating all these people to fight? There's a lot of Americans in their country. And it is very easy to then declare Islamic legitimacy for that. So in the post Cold War period, you see these interventions start to play a greater role. Also, in the post Cold War period, some of those technological shifts that I mentioned continue onward. So we see IEDs. We see continued use of the small arms weapons that I mentioned. We see the internet. We see an accelerated use of suicide car bombs. So again, warfare is in the hands of the people and continues to develop that way. By the time the Islamic State comes around 2012, 13, etc., we have some new technology. We have drones. We have more social media. I would argue that those technologies also helped put more power in the arms of in the hands of the people. It's not hard for terrorists and guerrillas to use drones. It's easy for us, but it's easy for them too. So I'd say up until now, from the history that we've seen, what we've seen is that warfare has been more in the hands of the people, and that's contributed to difficulties in state building. What I don't know is how things are going to proceed from here onward. I don't know enough of how ubiquitous technical surveillance is going to affect the ability of states to control guerrilla movements. I don't know how much AI is going to be able to affect their ability to control guerrilla movements. What Israel has done against Hezbollah, against Hamas, and against Iran, and their strikes against the leadership are impressive, highly impressive. I don't know enough yet. I don't think we don't know enough yet to see this is a shift in technology now, where we're now going to see states have greater power, or if these are just particularly unique, ingenious events.
I'm struck as I'm listening to you that we talk about the democratization of violence and it putting the power to wield violence or to use violence in the hands of the people. And yet a lot of the countries that we're talking about in the period that you wrote about in the article, which is up to 1992, from 1945 to 1992, are pretty autocratic. And so, in some ways, there's a tension or a paradox there in having forms of violence or types of patterns of violence that democratize it and technologies of violence that put the power to wield violence in the hands of people. And yet, you still have these heavily autocratic regimes in a large part of the region where the regime is in power not fully with the consent of the governed, at least as expressed through free and fair elections, but really through the threat of or monopoly of violence. And so I just ask you a little bit about what role you think regime type plays in this story about violence as it relates to states and societies?
That's an excellent question. I was thinking a lot as I was writing the article about, so Egypt and Pakistan, and I mean Israel without a doubt becomes a stronger state. But just looking at Egypt and Pakistan, they do become stronger, and their use of war does help make them stronger over time. So you wouldn't say that they fell apart, but you would say that Pakistan, to start with, has faced significant internal problems, a significant degree of violence. So I wouldn't say that Pakistan monopolizes violence. They may have the plurality of violence in their country, but they do not monopolize it by any means. Does that encourage them to be more autocratic? I'm not sure. I haven't studied that part of it enough to be certain about it. I think most of us would say, well, no, it's the India threat that keeps them more autocratic, or just how it's been set up in the first place, or the lack of civilian control of things, that those are the reasons it's autocratic. I'm not sure, but I think there is a reasonable hypothesis that when a state is facing internal disorder, that may push them towards autocracy as much as towards democracy. Now, in Egypt has had better control over its borders and over the country. It too has faced Muslim Brotherhood problems, various degrees of insurgency, not as bad as what's happened in Pakistan. So I don't know if that helps, but feel free to shoot back. It's a good question.
It's probably beyond the scope of the of certainly of the article and maybe of this discussion today, but I appreciate you sort of entertaining it because it seems like it's a question about who has the capacity to do violence and against whom. And so as we think about autocracy and the role that plays, regimes are different than states in some case significant ways and cases. And so this may be a case where you get a regime that has high coercive capacity, but that doesn't strengthen the state beyond that specific political or autocratic regime. Again, probably beyond the scope of the podcast today, but I thought at least a piece of it came out as you were speaking. So I appreciate you entertaining the question. Ryan, I'll hand it over to you to get us back on track.
I don't know. I was actually about to wander off track myself when you jumped in. So, but I will kind of bring it back around because I've been thinking a lot about this too. The democratization of warfare is really fascinating as you start to take what you've studied in the Middle East and start to expand that out and say, okay, how does this apply to the rest of the global South or to other similar governments? But I do want to come back. You highlighted in your article that in the form of nationalism and militarism, war partly defined identity and values. I was wondering, as we look at the way that Europe developed versus the way that South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East have developed, I was wondering if you could give us some examples or thoughts about how war shaped the identities and values of these societies as a comparison of how the Western world looks at it.
And I can follow up a little bit on some of the things I said a moment ago. So, take Egypt. Egypt is formed in a situation where it's still worried about British colonialism. It's worried about Israel, and it has a superpower competition it's got to deal with. That raises security issues to a high level, and makes Nasser feel he has to build a large army, even if fighting Israel wasn't his original intention. So he does that, and he tries to get the people more focused on warfare, having a conscript army, making sure Israel is painted as a threat, reaching out to the Palestinians. And that does have an effect. There are villages where people would say, no, we need to be ready to fight. We have to defend our homes, defend ourselves, often implying or saying we don't want to end up being taken over like Palestine. He does have a large conscript army. And by the 1973 war, Sadat is able to mobilize a large number of people for actually fighting. There's a book by a judge, Samir Fazl, and Samir Fazl was a judge starting under Nasser and then finishing up under Sadat. And he's a military judge. So he went all these places with the military and tried all these various places, went to Yemen, came back, saw the 67 war, then was going through the preparation for the 73 war and onward. And like with the 73 war, he says people wanted to go fight. When Sadat said this was going to be the year of decision and it wasn't a decision, there were leaders ready to rebel against him and overthrow him. And there were people and students who were out in the streets. So it was helping to create a sense of identity. But at the same time, they had trouble conscripting enough people to go. At the same time, the judge talks about how the military officers within the army had their own networks. Their own networks did what they wanted to do. They undermined military effectiveness. There was corruption involved. There wasn't unity of effort. So these same things would have trouble towards leading to the kind of states we've talked about previously. But they did lead to a degree of identity, just maybe not the same level of identity that, say, Israel or others might have. So you see that happening. And I've mentioned already about Pakistan a little bit, so I won't return to that. Another theme that's important here about how identity is created is some of the ways that the warfare maybe twisted identity a little bit, or twisted values. Values would be a better way to put it. Twisted values a little bit. The Iran-Iraq War martyrdom becomes something that's very highlighted by Khomeini. Martyrdom at that time, though, is you're a martyr in war, but if you die, it's not purposeful. They're not telling the besieged to all go out there and commit suicide. They may die from running into machine gun fire, but that is still random. So you're dying in the line of combat. You become a martyr through dying in the line of combat. Something that was a little bit more traditional in all of Islamic history. You get bin Laden, you get Abdul Azam, and you get them talking about suicide. And of course, Hezbollah is doing some of that too. So they're not the only people who are talking about this. Death by suicide. That starts to change how people think about things. That starts to change what the values are. There's another book by an Afghan who was a medic inside of Kandahar. And he liked to go and he'd talk to the Mujahideen leaders. And he'd go and sit with them and chat with them. Muhammad Tahir Aziz. And he has this book of all these stories of what these Mujahideen told him. And they're all great stories of them running around Kandahar, freeing prisoners, or getting intelligence, or sometimes helping people, but also assassinating people. And assassinating their own, like, Afghans. They're not assassinating Soviets. There's barely a Soviet that appears in the book. They're all other Afghans. And at one point, one of these Mujahideen commanders says, look what we're doing. I'm going to paraphrase this, and so it's not quite exactly right, but look, what we're doing is killing our own brothers. We're just like the enemy. We've become knotted and twisted. So that's another way that war shifts and changes things and changes values, maybe in a way that isn't the way that we would have liked to be seen. But going from a Michael Howard perspective, I like some of the stories like this because sometimes you have to look at things in a broad way to understand all the different ways society is affected by war.
I think that's a great and really valuable point. I wanted to ask you as we think about this broad sweep of the changing nature of conflict and violence in the greater Middle East, as you put it, why do you think it's important for us to study and to understand this history of war in society that you map out in this piece, particularly in this part of the world in this time frame? What is it that's really critical for us to take away and to learn from here?
So, I think one of them is that we should be a little bit modest in thinking how fast improvements can occur in the Middle East and South Asia. That doesn't mean they can't, because we don't know what the future is going to be. We don't know how things are going to change. But looking at the factors that exist there, we should understand that there's a combination of reasons as to why things have moved slow, why state building has moved slow, and why war has been consistent there, persistent. So we want to be pretty sober when we're looking at how fast things might change there. And that sobriety obviously affects if you want to, how much you want to invest U.S. resources in the area. But it also, unfortunately, affects how fast you think you can get away from the area. Because if these things still continue to exist there and these problems still exist and we feel we have some kind of interest, then it's very hard to let go of the region. So those are practical reasons to be paying attention to what's happening, and to be paying attention to the longer history, to know the fundamental reasons why these issues exist there. And I guess for a long time I've thought that we shouldn't think there are easy solutions. Well, in most of the world, and particularly in these kind of wars and these kind of situations, easy solutions make us think that we can do things simply without having to pay a lot of costs. That often turns out to be wrong. But then I also think that looking from a more academic perspective, we want to understand, why is it that we're studying war? Why is it we think war is important? And most of us do think it's important to some degree, but we may be biased because it's what we study or where you've served. But when you look at it to understand how it's changed a society, how it's affecting the values of society, how it's affecting the culture of a society, then we're getting a better grounding for why it matters. It's giving a better justification for the study of it, and a study that's not just for the practical application of it, a study for understanding truly why it matters and its true impact on the course of history. So I think that's why it's important to do, and I think it's easy for us to get focused on the immediate problems that affect the United States or the U.S.'s own history and warfare. We want to take into account the other areas of the world as well.
And that's, beyond a sort of pragmatic question of how do we use the lessons to guide this specific decision or that specific decision. It's something that transforms human lives and human societies. And so it's really important that we understand it on its own terms. So I thought that came out very clearly, especially in the last question, and appreciate you articulating that. So
No,
that's one
thank
of the
you.
things I loved about the piece. And I'm glad, one of the reasons why I was delighted to see it come to us.
No, thank you so much, and I appreciate the opportunity to publish with you guys, and because you guys allow longer form articles, and not so many others do that, and you allowed me to kind of write it in the way that I was trying to express things. Otherwise, I would have had to write a small book, I think, which that takes even more time.
Thanks for joining us on Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review. Our guest today is Carter Malkasian, author of Wars of the Middle East and South Asia, 1945 to 1992, which, as always, can be accessed for free on our website, tnsr.org. Carter, thanks very much for joining us today.
Sheena and Ryan, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the great work you guys have been doing at TNSR and getting great articles out there for everyone to read.
Well, if you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen, and you can always find more of our work at tnsr.org. Today's episode was produced by TNSR Digital and Technical Manager Jordan Morning and made possible by the University of Texas System. This is Sheena Chestnut Greitens and Ryan Vest. Thanks again for listening.